casually explained AI replacing jobs. A job does not disappear the moment it is automated. It disappears the moment someone realizes it can be broken into predictable decision patterns. Because once that happens, the task stops being work and starts being data. And the strange part is how quietly that realization spreads through entire industries long before layoffs ever begin. By 2026, AI replacing jobs is no longer a future prediction. It is a structural reallocation of labor, where cognitive tasks are gradually converted into probabilistic outputs, and the remaining human roles are defined less by execution and more by exception handling. What most explanations get wrong is assuming replacement is binary. It is not. It is incremental displacement through decomposition, where jobs are not removed but disassembled into microtasks, each evaluated for automation viability. And this is where psychology starts to break down, because most work is not unique insight. It is pattern repetition under constraints. Once systems learn those constraints, authority bias shifts from humans to models, especially when outputs are consistent, fast, and statistically good enough. But what makes this even more unusual is how quickly trust migrates to systems that cannot explain themselves. When a model produces reliable results, explanation becomes optional. Performance becomes the only credential that matters. And this detail changes everything, because now human value is no longer tied to knowing how something works, but to knowing when something is wrong. The role shifts from producer to verifier, from execution to oversight, from creation to correction, which leads to a far darker mechanism. As automation expands, organizations begin optimizing for cost reduction under uncertainty aversion. Tasks with variable human output become liabilities, while algorithmic consistency becomes financially predictable, even if imperfect. And researchers notice something unexpected. The first wave of automation does not target low-skill labor exclusively. It targets high-frequency cognitive labor writing, summarizing, basic analysis, because these tasks have the cleanest statistical structure. This is where cognitive dissonance quietly enters the workforce. Because individuals are told they are valuable for judgment, creativity, and problem-solving, while simultaneously seeing systems outperform them in increasingly routine cognitive outputs, the contradiction does not immediately resolve. It accumulates. But what makes this even more unusual is how role identity begins to detach from actual task execution. People continue identifying with jobs that no longer require their core skills, because identity lags behind structural change. And this detail changes everything, because employment is no longer just economic participation. It becomes symbolic participation in systems that may no longer depend on human input in the same way they used to. Which leads to escalation inside organizational structure. Middle layers of decision-making begin to compress. Reports, summaries, and communications that once justified large teams become automated artifacts. Management shifts from interpretation of human output to supervision of machine-generated pipelines. And this creates a subtle authority inversion. Humans begin trusting machine outputs because they are statistically consistent, while machines are trained on human-generated historical data, creating a feedback loop where past human behavior becomes the template for future decisions without active human correction. But what makes this even more unusual is how hiring processes adapt. Instead of evaluating raw production ability, systems begin evaluating prompt navigation, oversight skills, and anomaly detection skills that are structurally different from the original job descriptions. And this detail changes everything again, because now skill is not execution ability, it is interface ability. The most valuable workers are not those who can produce outputs, but those who can correctly guide and constrain automated systems. Which leads to a hidden labor shift. A large portion of work becomes invisible maintenance of automation itself. Cleaning datasets, correcting model outputs, adjusting prompts, validating edge cases. Work does not disappear. It becomes less legible and more distributed across systems. And researchers notice something even more counterintuitive. Productivity metrics often increase during early automation phases, not because humans are doing more, but because output is being reclassified as system-assisted rather than human-produced. This is where psychological stress accumulates silently, because individuals are evaluated against benchmarks that are no longer comparable to their original training environment. Performance comparisons become distorted, creating the illusion of underperformance even when actual capability remains unchanged. But what makes this even more unusual is how labor markets begin to stratify around ambiguity tolerance. Those who can work alongside imperfect systems thrive, while those who require stable, predictable workflows experience increasing friction. And this detail changes everything again. Because the defining skill is no longer expertise in a domain, but adaptability to continuous tool replacement. Every stable workflow becomes temporary by default, and every specialization risks decomposition into automatable subcomponents, which leads to a final structural layer. Economic systems do not stop functioning when jobs are automated. They reconfigure labor into oversight, exception handling, and system alignment roles. But the number of humans required for those roles is significantly lower than the number required for original execution-based systems. And that imbalance creates a long transition period where productivity rises faster than employment stability. So the question is not whether AI replaces jobs. It is how long societies can maintain the illusion that the same categories of work still exist, once most of what was once doing the job has already been quietly absorbed into systems that no longer need permission to operate. And somewhere in that gap between what work used to mean and what systems now do automatically, the definition of employment is already changing faster than the language used to describe it. So yeah, like and subscribe before your job gets reclassified as model-assisted behavior.